A carriage stopped in front of the elegant Beaumont Hotel in Ouray, Colorado, around 1890. Ouray, nicknamed the Switzerland of America for its spectacular mountain scenery, was founded during the silver mining boom. The Beaumont Hotel symbolized the refinement that mineral wealth brought to this remote mountain town. Devil's Tower in Crook County, Wyoming, around 1890. This volcanic rock formation, rising approximately 386 meters above the surrounding terrain, is sacred to numerous indigenous nations of the Great Plains. In 1906, it became the first national monument created by President Theodore Roosevelt under the Antiquities Act. Wyatt Earp's Northern Saloon in Tonopah, Nevada, around 1902. After leaving Tombstone and his legendary life as a lawman, Wyatt Earp continued exploring the American West, investing in saloons and mining ventures in various towns. Tonopah was one location where he attempted to rebuild his fortune in the Nevada desert. U.S. Deputy Marshal Bass Reeves photographed around 1902 in Kansas. A formerly enslaved man who became the first black federal officer west of the Mississippi River, Reeves accumulated more than 3,000 arrests throughout his career in Indian Territory. His reputation for courage and honesty was nearly unparalleled on the frontier. Johnny Ringo, the mysterious gunfighter, photographed around 1880. Ringo was one of the most enigmatic outlaws of the Wild West, moving in the same circles as Doc Holliday and the Earp brothers in Tombstone. He was found dead under a scrub oak in the Arizona Territory in July 1882 under circumstances never fully explained. Mickey Free, the famous Apache scout, with his wives Ethle and Ochehe, photographed around 1888. Mickey Free lived between two worlds, the Apache culture that raised him and the American Army he served. His role in events that precipitated the Apache Wars made him a historically controversial figure across the Southwest. Wyatt Earp, in 1925, photographed at an unknown location. Nearly 77 years old, Earp was still an imposing presence. This photograph, described by the original poster as a personal favorite of Earp in old age, captures a man who had survived an entire era of violence on the American frontier and lived to tell the tale. Chief Red Cloud, at age 77, photographed in 1898 by J.H. Bratley. Red Cloud was one of the most influential Native American leaders of the 19th century and the only chief who forced the United States government to sign a treaty on his own terms after winning Red Cloud's war against American forces in 1868. A prospector in a covered wagon pulled by burros in Las Vegas around 1900 to 1920. Burro-drawn wagons were an essential means of transport for miners exploring the remote regions of Nevada and Arizona. This type of independent prospecting was the dream of many adventurers during the Gold Rush era in the American West. Geronimo, the legendary Apache war leader, photographed around 1884. Goyaway, his name in Apache, resisted confinement on reservations for decades and became a worldwide symbol of indigenous resistance. His escapes and recaptures were covered by the American press as though they were episodes of an adventure novel. Siringo and Sayers, Pinkerton cowboy detectives, photographed around 1900. Charles Siringo was one of the most famous detectives of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which specialized in hunting Wild West outlaws such as Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. He later wrote several books about his adventures on the American frontier. A Texas cowboy with Southern Plains Indian beadwork, Kiowa or Comanche style, boots with spurs, a knife, and a revolver, around 1870. This image illustrates the rich cultural blend that defined Wild West cowboys, incorporating techniques and ornamentation from multiple cultures into a unique and composite frontier identity. Soapy Smith, Bob Ford, and Bat Masterson all found themselves in Creede, Colorado during the early 1890s, during the state's last silver boom. Creede was full of colorful characters. Ford had killed Jesse James, Soapy was the West's greatest con man, and Masterson was trying to keep some semblance of order in town. Quanah Parker, the last chief of the Comanches, photographed in Oklahoma around 1890. Son of Chief Peter Nocona and white captive Cynthia Ann Parker, Quanah was the last leader to resist reservation confinement before becoming one of the most skilled indigenous negotiators with the American government in the post-frontier era. The gun that killed Jesse James, a Smith & Wesson Schofield revolver in .45 caliber, fired into the back of the legendary outlaw by Robert Ford on April 3, 1882. Jesse James had become America's most famous criminal, and his death at the hands of a treacherous friend created one of the Wild West's most dramatic stories. A miner in his dugout home in Randsburg, California, around 1897. Dugout dwellings were common among prospectors living in arid regions where timber was scarce. Randsburg was founded in 1895 after gold was discovered and became a prosperous mining center in the California desert, drawing thousands of hopeful fortune seekers. On May 10, 1869, the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit, Utah, completing the first transcontinental railroad of the United States. The event marked the end of the stagecoach era and dramatically accelerated westward expansion, forever transforming the nature of American development and the fate of native peoples. A Piegan warrior holding a coup stick, a staff used in bravery rituals among plains peoples. Touching an enemy with the coup stick without killing him was considered the supreme act of courage among many indigenous nations. The Piegan people, also known as the Southern Blackfoot, inhabited Montana and southern Canada. The OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, after a fire that devastated part of the town in 1882. The corral became world famous for the gunfight of October 26, 1881, when Wyatt Earp, his brothers, and Doc Holliday faced the cowboy faction of the Clanton and McClory brothers in just 30 seconds of intense close-range violence. Hunter and fur trapper Stephen H. Meek and his dog at Fort James, California, around 1880. Meek was the brother of the famous Joe Meek and participated in pioneering expeditions to the Northwest. In 1845, he guided a wagon train of settlers along an alternate route to the Oregon Trail that proved to be a near-fatal disaster. Period photographs showing elegantly dressed men displaying Colt pocket revolvers of 1849. The Colt Pocket was one of the first truly portable and widely accessible revolvers in America, becoming an essential item for travelers, merchants, and frontiermen during the great period of Western expansion in the mid-19th century. Men in front of a brick yard in Butte, Montana, between 1885 and 1890. Butte was one of the world's largest mining centers during this period, famous for its copper extraction. The city became known as the greatest mining town on Earth and attracted workers from dozens of countries to labor in its deep underground mines. View of Dodge City, Kansas, around 1878. During this period, Dodge City was the primary destination for the massive cattle herds that traveled up from Texas along the Chisholm Trail. It was a city of contradictions, simultaneously violent and prosperous, with growing attempts to impose some form of law on its chaotic frontier life. 3 young indigenous men wearing leather pants and headbands, photographed in the Arizona and New Mexico territories around 1888. One wears a neck scarf and moccasins, another displays traditional ornaments. These portraits document the diversity of styles and identities among the indigenous nations of the American Southwest. View of Deadwood, South Dakota, between the 1870s and 1880s. The town, founded illegally on Lakota lands during the gold rush, grew rapidly in a chaotic explosion of prospectors, gamblers, and adventurers of every kind. It became a symbol of the Wild West in its rawest and most unregulated state during this turbulent era. The second most popular post on the R Wild West Pics subreddit in 2025 features the iconic image of dogs as an essential part of Uinta Ute culture, dated to the 1870s. This historical photograph documents the deep spiritual and practical relationship between the Ute people and their dogs, indispensable companions in their plains life. Billy Brooks, gunfighter and lawman in Kansas, photographed around 1872. 2 years after this photo was taken, in 1874, Brooks met his end when he was hanged for horse theft, a crime that in the Wild West frequently received a more severe punishment than many homicides due to the enormous economic stakes involved. Archie Clement, called by some the Devil's Head of Bloody Bill Anderson's guerrilla band, participated in the violent Centralia massacre in Missouri in 1864. Clement was one of the most brutal Confederate guerrillas and continued his violence after the war, being killed at 18 years old on a Lexington street in 1866. The Can-Can restaurant in Tombstone, Arizona, around 1880. The Can-Can was one of the most popular dining establishments in Tombstone during the silver mining boom. The town attracted people of every description, and its restaurants and saloons were gathering points for everyone from mine workers to the Earp brothers themselves. On December 15, 1890, Sitting Bull was killed by Indian police during an attempted arrest at his cabin on the Standing Rock Reservation. His death was directly connected to the growing ghost dance movement among the Lakota, which alarmed U.S. authorities and precipitated the massacre at Wounded Knee just 2 weeks later. Naiche and Geronimo at Fort Bowie, Arizona, before their exile to Florida in 1886. Naiche was the son of the great Chief Cochise and led the Chiricahua alongside Geronimo. After their surrender, both were sent as prisoners of war to Florida and later to Oklahoma, where Geronimo died in 1909, never allowed to return home. An unidentified Ute man on a hunt, photographed in 1899. The Ute people were known for their hunting skills in the mountains and plains of Colorado and Utah. This documentary photograph captures a moment of their everyday life during a period of profound change forced by the advancing tide of American colonial settlement. Red Cloud, the great Oglala Lakota leader. Makpia Luta was the only Native American chief to win a war against the United States government, forcing the abandonment of Forts Reno, Phil Kearny, and C.F. Smith in 1868. After the peace, he spent decades as a spokesman for his people before the American government. Workers laying the railroad bed for the gold mines out of Quigley, Montana, around 1892. The expansion of railroads across the American West was one of the 19th century's greatest engineering projects and one of the most decisive factors in transforming the plains and ending the traditional way of life of indigenous peoples. Law officers involved in the battle with Ned Christie on November 1, 1892, posed for photographs shortly afterward. Christie was a Cherokee blacksmith wrongly accused of killing a federal marshal. After years of resistance in his improvised fort, he was killed when authorities finally demolished his fortified defenses. On June 17, 1876, Native forces led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull defeated Lieutenant Colonel George Crook's troops at the Battle of the Rosebud, just days before the annihilation of Custer at Little Bighorn. This double victory represented the peak of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne military power in the 19th century. A tombstone from Boot Hill Cemetery around August 1881. Boot Hill cemeteries were the burial places of violence victims in the Wild West, many of whom died with their boots on, the expression that gave these graveyards their names. Tombstone had its own Boot Hill, where victims of the OK Corral gunfight are buried. Billy the Kid, photographed around 1880. William Henry McCarty Jr., also known as William Bonney, is recognized from the only authenticated photograph of him. Approximately 21 years old at his death, he became the most famous outlaw of the Wild West. Sheriff Pat Garrett shot him at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, in July 1881. A family portrait in Tennessee, 1909, parents, children, a dog, and a highly visible firearm. This image reveals how guns were a natural part of everyday American life in the early 20th century, particularly in rural areas of the South, where self-sufficiency and the capacity for self-defense were deeply held cultural values. 4 Navajo horsemen in Cañón del Muerto, a branch of Cañón de Chelly in Arizona, around 1905. Cañón del Muerto, whose name means Canyon of the Dead in Spanish, was the site of a massacre of Navajo people by Spanish forces in 1805. This historically charged landscape permeates the collective memory of the Diné, the grave of Wild Bill Hickok at Mount Moriah Cemetery in Deadwood, South Dakota, around 1900. James Butler Hickok was murdered by Jack McCall on August 1, 1876, while playing poker, reportedly holding a hand of aces and eights, forever known as the Dead Man's Hand in the folklore of the American frontier. A soldier of the 10th U.S. Cavalry Regiment, the famous Buffalo Soldiers Regiment, poses with 3 Apache scouts at Fort Whipple, Arizona, around 1885. Buffalo Soldiers were regiments of infantry and cavalry composed of African American men who served with great distinction across the American West after the Civil War. An Absaroki warrior from the Crow tribe on horseback in snow-covered terrain in the Pryor Mountains of Montana, 1908, by Edward S. Curtis. This image captures the majestic solitary figure of a Crow winter scout, representing both an everyday scene of watchfulness and a poetic symbol of life on the snow-covered plains. Faro gamblers at the White Elephant Saloon in Bingham, Utah, around 1906. Faro was the most popular card game in Wild West saloons, far more common than poker. Simple to learn but difficult to master, Faro attracted everyone from penniless cowboys to legendary figures like Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp at the gaming tables. An unpaved street in Santa Barbara, California in 1876, looking east on De La Guerra Street at Anacapa Street. The photograph captures Santa Barbara before its development as a resort town. Southern California in 1876 still bore vivid marks of its Spanish colonial and Mexican heritage in its architecture and street layout. Mexican bandits are executed by firing squad around 1910. The Mexican Revolution, which began in 1910, transformed northern Mexico and the American border regions into zones of extreme conflict. Summary executions were common on both sides of the fighting, reflecting the brutality characteristic of civil wars throughout history. The face of outlaw Tom "Blackjack" Ketchum, moments before his hanging in Clayton, New Mexico in 1901. The execution became grimly notorious because the rope used was too long for his weight, resulting in decapitation. The photograph taken shortly afterward is one of the most disturbing images from the Wild West era. Close-up of the famous tintype of Billy the Kid, the only confirmed authentic photograph of the legendary outlaw. The image shows a gawky young man with disheveled hair and a crooked hat, quite different from popular romantic depictions. In 2011, a copy of this photograph sold for $2.3 million at auction. A Navajo family with their loom near Old Fort Defiance, New Mexico, photographed by Timothy H. O'Sullivan in 1873. Weaving is a central art of Navajo culture, with famous Navajo blankets and rugs being highly prized. O'Sullivan was one of the first photographers to systematically document the American West for history. A group of military Apache scouts, probably in Globe, Arizona, in 1880. Apache scouts were indispensable to the American Army in southwestern campaigns, as they knew the terrain far better than any soldier. Many Apache who served as scouts did so to help locate rival Apache bands, navigating complex intertribal loyalties.